I wasn't planning on doing a second, very long, very heavy video, but here we are. The Earth has suffered 5 mass extinctions before this one. This one is the 6th, already, caused by humans both directly and indirectly. The dinosaurs were wiped out by an asteroid and the attendant effects that came after it. Every single other one of these mass extinctions was down to climate change. The extinction event 250 million years ago was due to warming by 5 degrees, which is within our current projections if we don't change course. We're adding carbon to the atmosphere at a rate 10 times faster, 100 times faster, than at any other point in human history. There's a third more carbon in the atmosphere now than at any point in at least the last 800,000 years, perhaps as many as 15 million years. 400 parts per million of atmospheric CO2 was the target and the red line for a very long time. We're at 411 and rising. The Syrian civil war displaced 1 million people, and that conflict was worsened by our already existing degree of climate change. By 2050, we're anticipating 200 million refugees, as much from climate as conflict. Flooding in Bangladesh, famine in Africa and South America, water shortages and the conflicts that follow these disruptions. That's a lowball estimate. The high end is 1 billion people, 1 in 8 of the world's population displaced, in part because of climate. At Kyoto, 2 degrees was agreed on as the point of catastrophe that must be avoided, but we'll almost certainly reach that. That's enough to wipe out whole island-dwelling peoples and nations. If we don't make changes now, we are quite likely to see a warming as high as 5 degrees, a hothouse Earth not seen since the Eocene. A mere 2 degrees warming, a virtual certainty, and the ice sheets probably collapse. 400 million people are thrust into water scarcity. Equatorial cities become virtually non-viable because of the heat. Heat waves will kill thousands each summer in the northern hemisphere and tens or even hundreds of thousands in the southern. 500 parts per million of CO2 is bandied about as the new target. Last time the Earth had those levels, the sea was 130 feet higher. That would take the US coastline as far in as the I-95. Climate change is already here, with higher frequency and higher intensity of what used to be freak weather events. That's now the new normal. There is a cost associated with changing how we do things, but there's also a cost associated with not changing. One estimate is that 1 degree of warming is equivalent to knocking 1% of GDP off of a temperate climate, first world developed nation such as the United States. 2 degrees, half a degree over the current target, costs the world $20 trillion more. 3.5 degrees takes it to 551 trillion in damages. Current global wealth is 280 trillion. Likely projections from the current state of affairs take us to 4 degrees, which all but wipes out any possibility of ongoing economic growth. The difference just between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees is immense. It's 150 million people dying just from air pollution. That's 25 holocausts, an event that still reverberates today in our geopolitics. Climate alarmism is virtually impossible. It's hard to be hysterical when things are this bad. The bald facts sound hysterical, but they're not. 4 degrees is likely if we don't continue to change and innovate. That means 16 times as many wildfires in the American West. That means hundreds of new Venices. That means that summers in India and the Middle East will become lethal. That will already be the case, more often, without any further warming. Climate models are uncertain not because we don't understand the science, though precision on tipping points is hard to discern, but because how we respond to change is hard to predict. One need only look to the climate change denialists, no doubt in the comments of this very video, to see just how much there is to overcome in order to get people to act. When it comes to food, for our staple cereal crops, yield drops 10% or so for every degree of warming. Grain is about 40% of the human diet. Add in corn and soy, and you get to 2/3 of our intake. CO2 is good for plants, but not as good for our staple grains as it is for weeds. Too much CO2 and plants actually become less good at absorbing it, another unseen tipping point. Fungus, disease, more natural disasters like flooding affecting crops, it's no single thing. We can examine certain aspects in isolation, but the overall chaotic, unpredictable effect is likely to be much worse. Even though new croplands will open up, and the wheat belt is moving north at about 160 miles every 10 years, eventually there's nowhere else to go, and the northern soils are of lower quality in any case. Urbanisation and clear-cutting is making the problem even worse. Fertile soil is being washed away into the seas, accelerated by climate change. 75 billion tonnes of soil every year. Can we adapt? Maybe we could, hypothetically. Historically, we haven't. The farmers in the Dust Bowl could have adapted, planted different crops, but they didn't. Habit and ritual and tradition are hard to break. We have innovated in many ways, making Malthus and Ehrlich look like idiots, but many of our food innovations cannot hold, or rely on finite fossil fuels that only hasten climate change. Ironically, of course, the green movement is often also against GM, or advocates for fool's errands like veganism, which would worsen many of these problems as much or more than our meat-heavy diet does. We have done wonders in raising the quality of life of people, even in what have been called shithole countries, with industrialisation, education and reform. But that has also accelerated climate change, and we in the developed world have been justifiably nervous about spreading nuclear power, about it being developed by many of these places which can be unstable. We should be aiding them in leapfrogging the filthy industrial growing pains into an era of smaller populations, cleaner industry and post-industrialisation. But it's not economic good sense, or at least so it seems in the short term, to do so. Even today, the undernourished are numbered 800 million. 100 million of that is estimated to be due to climate shocks, and it's set to rise. We have the means and the capacity to end world hunger, but we do not do it. The strain is going to get worse. Hidden hunger, insufficient micronutrients, affect at least 1 billion people. Famines make the news and draw the attention of Bob Geldof, but this is an ongoing, somewhat invisible problem. The obesity epidemic in the USA and the food bank crisis in the UK are driven by economic food poverty rather than actual shortage. We're just awful at distribution and affordability. China, often a target of ire from Americans who don't want to give up their SUVs, for all its flaws is capable of thinking long term, and are investing in customised and technological farming practices to cut the use of fossil fuel fertilisers. Airponics and hydroponics, farming that doesn't use soil, these are gaining more interest, but can we produce enough food in this industrialised, high-cost way to feed the world? Even with vertical farming, sea farming and vat-grown meat, these are all on the way, but like fusion power, they always seem to be 20 years off. GMO would be a way out of much of this, but there is a strange cultural resistance to Frankenstein food, and exploitation of the technology by companies like Monsanto has soured the farming community and tarnished the image of the technology for the consumer. More CO2 means plants produce more carbohydrates, and that displaces other nutrients that the plants gather. Nutrition in plants beyond carbohydrate energy has declined by 1/3 since the 1950s. We can make plants grow, but we can't necessarily make them grow well. By 2050, 150 million people may be facing protein deficiency, 138 million a zinc deficiency, 1.4 billion a shortage of iron. More CO2 means less of these things, less protein, less iron, less zinc, less vitamins B1, B2, B5 and B9. Vitamin E seems to be alright. Pretty much. Even if people don't die from being undernourished, their health, their development, especially in children, could be retarded. Lower IQs, weaker bodies. 600 million people or so with stunted intellectual and physical development, most of them in areas that are already poor and strained. If we don't reduce emissions, if we don't move into negative emissions, the sea will rise by at least 4 to 8 feet by 2100. This may not sound like much. If it comes to that, I'll just stand on a chair, you might think. Just that amount drowns Facebook's headquarters, swallows up the Kennedy Space Center and the naval base at Norfolk, Virginia. The Maldives and the Marshall Islands are gone, most of Bangladesh is gone, Miami Beach and South Florida are gone, and on it goes, including Trump's Mar-a-Lago, ironically, given his bullish pseudo-scepticism about climate. Humans settle on coasts and floodplains because these areas are fertile and provide a good quality of life. Less so when they flood, particularly when that flood is permanent. Particularly when that flood is saltwater. This means hundreds of millions of refugees from a lot of the biggest cities that there are, with all their infrastructure and technology and wealth swallowed up. Global damages just from this could hit 14 trillion per year. River flooding is another issue, and with this amount of change and the rise in rainfall, we would see double the river flooding in South America, 12 million people affected. In Africa, the number affected could rise from 25 to 35 million people. In Asia, from 70 to 150 million. And even a full mobilization of the People's Army and all its reservists couldn't move enough sandbags to prevent that. 2 degrees means flooding 10 times as often and half again as deadly. Top that up whenever a flood or a mudslide makes the news. 40 million Americans would be at risk. These estimates are somewhat conservative. At 1.2 degrees warming, the Greenland ice sheet is likely to reach its tipping point. Just that going could raise the sea 6 yards, not 6 feet. The last time the Earth was 4 degrees warmer, the seas were 160 feet higher, and the poles warm faster than the rest of the world. That 4 degree hotter world meant palm trees in the Arctic back then. Imagine what that would mean for the equator. One big chain reaction that we're on the verge of is outgassing from the loss of permafrost. As it melts, ancient methane, CO2 and other gases are given off, accelerating climate change. This is already a problem in places like Siberia, where the sudden softening of the soil and the emergence of gases has created sinkholes, explosions, threatened infrastructure. Then there's the methane hydrates locked in the frozen depth of the sea. Enough warming and even they turn from solid to gas, and methane is a greenhouse gas. If warming continues, our efforts to curtail it may be dwarfed by permafrost contributing 100 billion tons of CO2 to the atmosphere. Half again as much damage as we have already done since industrialization. We've already talked about the wildfires in the American West, but it provides a stark example of how climate change will affect different people in different ways. In the most recent American conflagration, these fires threatened the very wealthy, who employed private firefighters to protect their billion-dollar homes, while conscripted convicts on $1 a day fought to protect everyone else. Money will insulate you, but not forever on an individual and national scale. This is why people conflate social justice and economic justice with climate change, when they're not being stupid or hyperbolic. Deforestation creates 12% of our current carbon emissions. Forest fires contribute 25%. A hotter climate means more fires, which means more emissions and less carbon locked up in trees and plants. Yet another positive feedback loop, like the methane. And again, climate change is already here. Storms have doubled since 1980. New York City is set to suffer 500-year flood events every 25 years and climbing. There are 40% more heavy rainstorms now than in 1950, and the heaviest downpours are 3/4 bigger than they were then. In America, the costs of dealing with these problems, just the rain bombs, has increased 7-fold since 1980. Power outages have doubled since 2003. Hurricane Irma was nearly given a new classification, Category 6, and it was followed swiftly by Hurricane Maria that wiped out power and water for Puerto Rico for months. 1 degree of warming means 25% more Category 4 and 5 hurricanes, and typhoons are already 10% more powerful than they were just 40 years ago. The proportion of Category 4 and 5 storms has doubled in that same period. Asian cities lost $3 trillion due to storms in 2003, and that's been climbing. Overall, warming increases the intensity of weather, even weather that idiots try to use to claim that the planet isn't warming. The warmer the Arctic, the more intense the blizzards in the Northern Hemisphere, as we've been experiencing. Tornado Alley has moved 500 miles in just 30 years, and tornadoes are leaving longer and wider trails of destruction. 71% of the Earth's surface is covered in water, barely 2% of that is fresh water, and only 1% of that is truly accessible. We need that sliver of fresh water to drink, but also for agriculture and industry. With a burgeoning population and problems created by pollution and climate change, we're likely to outstrip our supply of fresh water by 2030 by 40%. Again, yet again, this will disproportionately affect the southern hemisphere. As with food, we have enough water and we have solutions such as desalination. We're just terrible at distribution and getting it done. As with other issues around climate, this crisis is already here, or at least its vanguard is. In Cape Town, they hit day 0 in March 2018, meaning there was no more water. This created conflict along old class and race lines, as wealthy whites accused poor blacks of stealing and wasting water. Conspiracy theories emerged about political indifference, and, chillingly, supposed secret Israeli technology that was being used to disrupt their water supply. Rationing, and a sensible collective approach, could have weathered the crisis, but 2/3 of the population broke the water restrictions that had been placed on usage. Even then, personal water consumption is not even close to the biggest issue here. Industrial and agricultural usage is. To make the point again about this already being here, it's drought that destabilised Venezuela as much or more than its politics. It's climate change that aggravated the Syrian civil war, and there's more to come. Warming has driven fish stocks north, flounder by 250 miles, mackerel so far north that they're now beyond EU waters. Parts of the Arctic are no longer scientifically really considered to be Arctic in character. More exotic and invasive species from southern climes are now seen in more northern waters more often, even in the coast around Britain. The ocean currently offsets a lot of our carbon output by absorbing it. But there's a limit, and that comes at a cost. Ocean acidification, and the near certain loss of coral reefs as a result, the rainforests of the sea. Less known than acidification as a problem is anoxidation. An increasing amount of ocean water has little to no oxygen. Some of this is driven by climate change. Warm water carries less oxygen. Some of it is driven by pollution. But this turns swathes of the ocean into effective deserts that can no longer sink our carbon. Even massive algal blooms, which can capture a lot of carbon, are not necessarily a blessing. They're frequently toxic to man and fish alike, or give off poisonous gases as they rot. Ironically, one major and sudden effect of climate change could be the cutting off of the Gulf Stream and the abrupt freezing of Western and Northern Europe. The Gulf Stream carries warm water across the ocean, giving Ireland and the United Kingdom their characteristic wet, muggy climates. Without the Gulf Stream, London is on the same latitude as Calgary in Canada, where winters have an average low of minus 13 degrees centigrade in January. Currently, London has an average low in the same month of 2.3 degrees centigrade positive. Warming could freeze us. For whatever reason, we sometimes see the environment as separate to us, but it can have an effect on our bodies. We are unlikely to suffocate. But if the CO2 levels double, our cognitive abilities will decline by around 20%. This is aggravated indoors in urban living where CO2 builds up. Elementary school classrooms have been measured even today as having levels over 1,000 parts per million, over that doubling. Open a damn window. Airplanes are even worse. CO2 isn't the only issue. Droughts worsen air quality, fires worsen air quality, hot and sluggish air retains pollutants for longer and concentrates them. By 2050, Americans will be dealing with 70% more ozone smog alone. By 2090, 2 billion people may be breathing air worse than the WHO's safe ranking. Even today, and yes, again the problems are already here, 10,000 people a day die from air pollution related issues. That's more people dead per day than have been killed in total by nuclear power. We've dealt with leaded petrol, but now we find that fuels like diesel and the nanoparticles that they produce have their own issues. Catalytic converters made our exhaust cleaner, but they turned it into CO2. Shifting winds due to climate change can provide relief to some areas, but Asian weather shifts since 2013 have caused the north of the country to be smothered by smog, no longer blowing it away. In Delhi in 2017, the air quality index hit 999, the equivalent of smoking 2 packs of cigarettes per day. Hospitals admitted 20% more patients. Marathon runners had to run in breathing masks. It's already here. 9 million particulate-related deaths in 2017, 25% of those in India, and that's not accounting for that spike around the marathon. Microplastics are accumulating in the ocean food chain in the way that pesticides once did on land, causing a catastrophic decline in seabirds and entering our food chain, in particular, via filter-feeding shellfish. It's in our beer, it's in our honey, it's in our sea salt, and it's plastic more than soy, gentlemen, that releases feminizing chemicals. Disease is another immediate and relatable problem. Not only are tropical diseases creeping north, the upside to which is that the first world might start taking malaria seriously, but ancient enspored pathogens are defrosting from the permafrost and the next plague might be amongst them. We may not get a choice when it comes to depopulation and it could be catastrophic. If you think that can't happen, laboratories have already revived 32,000-year-old, 3.5 million-year-old and 8 million-year-old germs. A crazy Russian scientist injected himself with the 3.5 million-year-old one. We're very fortunate that it wasn't a zombie plague. In 2018, scientists even managed to revive a 42,000-year-old frozen worm, a multicellular organism. So it's not just germs, but parasites, entirely new to us, that may come back from the distant past. Remember Zika? Yes, that, but more so, and in the Northern Hemisphere. It seems almost churlish in the face of all this ecological disaster to even pause to consider the political and economic impacts of all this, but this is all that some people seem to care about. The sooner we act, the more likely we are to avoid total economic collapse or the advent of extreme political systems, such as the eco-fascism some so-called skeptics seem so concerned about, or command economy fascism or communism, which may be necessary even to cope with the disasters. Climate change will probably reduce global economic output by 20% by 2100, and almost certainly 10%. For comparison, the Great Recession shrank the economy by around 3% and helped give us Trump and Brexit. The Great Depression shrank the economy by about 10% and gave us Hitler and Stalin. So we're looking at an overall political impact of approximately 1 to 2 Hitlers, and the climate impact would be ongoing, not a singular, recoverable event. We've skirted conflict and climate's already existing effects there. Even if you don't agree that these are proximate causes, climate change increases the frequency and intensity and aggravates situations and divisions, making such conflict more likely. Can we afford more wars? Endless wars for declining oil reserves, to secure fresh water, to seize viable farming land as it marches north? How will desperation drive oppression, expansionism, the viability of war, the justification for the use of weapons of mass destruction? When wealthy countries are staring down massive refugee caravans, hundreds of millions of displaced people that they cannot hope to absorb, how long before borders become weaponized? This isn't some pipe dream. Military analysts regard all this as a real and serious threat and problem, however skeptical their populist governments pretend to be. They're already making plans, and the conflicts that we are already in are intimately tied to climate issues and future-proofing. Migration is already at a record high. 70 million people worldwide have been displaced, and that's only going to go up. Those who are left behind are not much better off, as government and social fabric breaks down as it did in the ghost towns, and as it has in the feral cities of the abandoned American Rust Belt. We'll be looking at whole feral countries, some with old but deadly Cold War weapons and material rotting away, or worse, pressed into action. Somalia already went this way, others will likely follow. Even without war, poverty and insecurity increased by climate change will create a crisis of policing. By 2100, America, but most research seems to be done on the US, could be looking at 22,000 more murders, 180,000 more rapes, 3.5 million more assaults, and 3.76 million more robberies. Pollution may also drive this. We saw a small but noticeable reduction in criminality when we got rid of lead in petrol. If the air gets worse and people get duller and stupider, if they're less nourished, if they don't develop fully, they're more likely to become criminal, insane, or malcontent. This is even without accounting for the societal breakdowns we see after major weather events like Katrina, and these will become more common. They can also have long-term effects on people who live through them: PTSD, personality problems, depression, anxiety. All of this is paraphrased and summarised from the frankly terrifying book The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace-Wells, all referenced. I've made this video because in talking about eco-poster child Greta Thunberg, the climate change denialists came out of the woodwork, and I became painfully aware that even otherwise quite reasonable people appear to be so terrified by the very possibility that this is true, that they retreat into denial and pseudo-scepticism with the gay abandon of a creationist confronted with the evidence for evolution. Clearly, this is something that more time needs to be spent on, talking about it, debunking the denialist arguments. This is a role for the skeptic community. It's not hopeless. There are things we can do as individuals, nations, companies, and internationally, but we have to do them whether other people are doing them or not, whether other countries do them or not. We need to reforest, create local power, food and water grids, decentralize to create resilience to incoming climate disasters, as we did with the internet. We need to seaweed farm, invest heavily in preparations and defences, multiple Manhattan projects to tackle the issues we face, and to find technological solutions, because merely stopping what we're doing isn't enough at this point. The sooner we act, the cheaper it is. The sooner we act, the less likely extreme economic and political damage is. The sooner we act, the safer the geoengineering and technological solutions we'll have to use will be. This is an existential threat to our species, and if we can't take it seriously, if we refuse to believe the science because we find it uncomfortable or unsettling, if we're unwilling to give up some small amount of luxury to stay alive, then we don't deserve to call ourselves sapiens.
When I was just a baby, my mama told me, son, always be a good boy, don't ever play with guns. But I shot a man in Reno